Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Taita Terer from National Museums of Kenya. I'm a research scientist by profession, wetland ecologist. I have an interest in doing aquatic sciences, especially on aquatic plants, population genetics, and sustainable use of those aquatic resources. So I'm a museum, and museum is a research institution where, as you can see, where heritage lives. So we undertake research on both cultural and natural heritage for Kenya. We also do this research spanning from archaeological findings to taxonomic to up to ecosystem levels. And we also have a very strong component in terms of dissemination of this information through our galleries, through publication, and through exhibition. So this is the outline of my presentation. I'll give a brief introduction on the link between agriculture, climate change, and water catchment areas in Kenya. Give some highlights of laws, regulation, policies, and strategies that we have in place, and briefly give our experience on TEEBAgriFood International Climate Initiative project in Kenya, basically on the inception workshop that we've had, all the consolidation with our stakeholders, selection of the study site, and development of communication strategy. So Kenya economy actually, and even people livelihood depend highly on our natural resources. And this with a heavy reliance on climate sensitive sectors, which include agriculture, tourism, and energy. And rainfed forest agriculture accounts for 98% of agricultural activities, and over 70% of rural livelihoods are dependent on rain-fed subsistence agriculture, which are actually vulnerable to climate variability and change. So the agricultural sector is the mainstay of our economy, which accounts for 26% of the GDP and accounting for 65% of Kenya's total exports. You think of flowers in the world market, they are mostly coming from Lake Naivasha, and it also contributes to more than 18% of the formal employment, of which over 70% are from the rural setup. We also note that agriculture is the biggest user of freshwater resources in Kenya. And this brings me to the issue of water catchment areas, which plays a very important role in supporting agriculture, either directly or indirectly, even through the water cycle. And basically, we have some strategies in Kenya. One of them is the Kenya Vision 2030, where we really acknowledge that in order to increase, we need to increase productivity in agricultural sector to ensure food security for rapidly increasing population, at the same time improve processes to add value to the agricultural sector and increase farmers' income. But you realize that we face so many challenges. In order to do this, there is problem to do with soil erosion, people cultivating in very steep gradient. We have soil infertility, biodiversity loss, and of course the climate change. So to address these challenges, Kenya has put in place many laws, policies, plans, strategies, and one of them is Kenya Constitution, which is a supreme law in all the countries. And in this constitution, which was revised recently in 2010, it gives actually environment and natural resources management as a very special place, and One of them is in the Bill of Rights, Article 142, where every citizen has a right to a clean and healthy environment. It also, in the same document, stipulates that effort should be made to maintain a tree cover of at least 10% of the land area in Kenya. And in the same document, it also requires to establish a system of environmental impact assessment, audit, and monitoring of the environment. This is very key in what we are doing in a agri-food project. Vision 2030 is a long-term development plan for Kenya, aiming at making Kenya a prosperous nation by the year 2030, which is being implemented in what we are calling 5-year medium-term plans, and it recognizes the conservation of water catchment areas, which is actually a priority program in this Vision 2030. We now have what we are calling the Big Four agenda, and which includes the manufacturing, food and nutrition, housing and universal healthcare coverage. And one of it, which is the food and nutrition, is actually closely aligned to the agri-food project. In the agricultural sector, we have the Agricultural Act, which is a principal legislation governing agricultural activities here in Kenya. And it has even agricultural farm forestry rules, which promote farm forestry. We have agricultural sector development strategy, which is supposed to be implemented between 2010 to 2020. And this is the overall national policy for the agricultural sector in Kenya. And it actually promotes an innovative, commercially oriented and climate smart agriculture, which aims at having agricultural growth of 7% and reduce poverty by 30%. And as we talk now, there is a strategy which is being revised, and it's called Agriculture Sector Growth and Transformation Strategy, which is actually in the making. And I must note that when we were doing all this consultation with the Ministry of Agriculture and environmental ministries, they were able to recognize that they've not actually captured the issue of biodiversity or the value of ecosystem. And we got a chance to review it so that a biodiversity component is integrated into the strategy. We also have what we are calling Kenya Smart Agricultural Strategy, which is supposed to be implemented from 2017 to 2026. And the aim is actually to help the sector adapt to climate change, build resilience of agricultural system, while minimizing emission for enhanced food and nutrition security and improve livelihoods.
We just have 3 minutes. Can we move on to what you're doing? Because I think that's more relevant.
Okay. So the TEEB project, we are supposed to measure, quantify, and value the full benefits and costs of agricultural activities. And this is where we started the consolidation process in Kenya. Our journey started last year, where we brought in stakeholders from government ministries, from private sector, from academia, and even UN organization. And the outcome was that we managed to create awareness and seek support among the stakeholders. And we also managed to adopt and form a steering committee, which consists of the various ministries, private sector, and of course the National Treasury. And this committee were able to select among the options that were done during the inception workshop, the Mau Forest Complex, which is a very important ecosystem in Kenya because it's main Kenya towers, water towers, and all the agricultural activities, tourism, wildlife is being supported by this very important ecosystem. And it has also a very important cultural value because it's a home to one of the indigenous communities, the Okiek, which derive their livelihood from this ecosystem. So briefly, our institution, through a recent study, we found that this ecosystem is very important in terms of like insect pollinators. It has also like wild plants which are relative to the crops, like the wild berries, cassava, banana, and the millet. And finally, we managed to do a communication strategy for the project, which essentially is to help us create awareness among the various stakeholders. And of course, in this strategy, we aspire to influence the behavior of all the key stakeholders, groups, to promote land use and decision that takes into consideration the value of nature, and actually that will guarantee better harvest and sustainable livelihood for current and future generations. Thank you very much for listening.
Very much. Let's take about 10-15 minutes for questions before we go to the next session. So with that, can I ask if anyone has any questions they want to ask to any of the panelists, or any general remarks? Preferably questions. We have lots of comments today. Any questions first? Any questions? Yeah, Pietro.
A small question, more curiosity. I was wondering, what's the time frame of these projects? Is it like quarter or a year or more than a year?
I can answer that. The time frame of the project, currently the project ends the end of this year. We may seek an extension from the IKI Secretariat for various reasons, but currently ends the end of this year. Any other questions or comments to the panel?
I have a question, not necessary for the panel, but I mean, I see that there is agri-food complexes are really complex and huge systems, no? How do you identify the specific inputs in the system that you have probability to change, to really insight, so that you can change the system and the path that the system is taking? I don't know if I made myself understand.
I think, well, sorry? Does anyone on the panel want to answer that, or? It's a very, okay, I would suggest it's probably quite a difficult question in some respects. So what we have to do, my previous answer, is the reason it's taken a long time with IKI countries, we've been very, very precise in defining, as far as we can, the scenarios. And the scenarios look at different intervention options, which include inputs to the system. The inputs in the end, and the changes inputs to the system, in the end we're looking at, because they're creating outcomes, which we propose are going to be beneficial in terms of livelihoods and terms of conservation outcomes. So we always have to look for changes in terms of inputs to the system which are viable, credible, for which there's a governance structure for that input change to occur. But as you pointed out, and you've seen in the last 2 days, the complexity of that is very large. And even getting to that point and decide on that intervention is a really interesting and instructive process. And I think we can say that certainly in each of the 4 stakeholder meetings, there were situations, for instance, where agriculture and ecosystems ministries were talking about this really for the first time as a consequence of our project. So even as you were mentioning in terms of the Millennium Institute, it very much is the case that even the process of applying the TEEBAgriFood study creates benefits, I would argue, which are very different from, say, for instance, an academic research proposal, say when I was at Edinburgh, where the academic decides in advance, but I'm looking at this compared to this, I'm now going to do it. Yeah? So there's been a 2-year process to make that happen, and a very constructive process today. Any other further questions or comments on the studies? Okay. Yes, please. Yasmin, go ahead.
I have a comment on what has been discussed also by Colombia, the difficulty of also including the agricultural sector. And I just wanted to share our experiences from Mexico and from our Inception workshop, which we held last week, because actually at this workshop we had like 50% from the agricultural sector participants and 50% from the environmental sector, and the workshop was actually hosted by the Agriculture Ministry. So maybe this is just of interest to the participants here, how we did it. I mean, on the one hand, we have a positive political situation at the moment in Mexico, but what we also did is that during the last years when we prepared starting the study, we very much focused our dialogue with the Agriculture Ministry on positive experiences. So there has been a lot of difficulties in the dialogue between the agricultural and the environmental sector, because also in Mexico there's a lot of subsidies, or there have been a lot of subsidies with negative impacts on the environment, but we kind of not mentioned it. When we engaged with the agricultural sector, we were looking a lot into their programs on agro biodiversity and genetic diversity in the agricultural sector. We picked a lot of case studies with small-scale farmers that we have, and every time we engaged with them, we only looked at the positive sides to really include them as part of the solution. And I think that is why we got this positive uptake from the agricultural sector and them really leading this TEEB approach. Because, yeah, even though there are a lot of problems with the agricultural sector, we focused on the positive examples. Just as a lessons learned from our first steps on TEEB, which might be helpful also for other countries.
Thank you, Yasmin. That is very helpful. And I think we've tried to do that. And then what I'll probably do is ask the panelists, and each of them in turn have mentioned this, but basically the challenges you faced in terms of the interaction and trying to get what may not be your core constituency on board. So I'll ask in a second. But just to say, what I presented on day one to introduce and day two to introduce, in terms of suggesting and presenting that TEEBAgriFood is not agriculture bashing, was taken through to inception workshops as well. It was also taken through to the earlier dialogues that we had, even before the inception workshops, with the ministries to make sure that they understood exactly what this project was about, and it was trying to create positive synergies, when in many cases agriculture and environment seem to be in conflict. And obviously, in terms of political economy, it's very sensible to steer away from certain issues which might be politically very, very sensitive, which we've tried to do as well. But why don't I just, as a final comment to the panel then, or question, you've touched on it already, but maybe go through, if you have any final comments, but particularly if you can talk about the interaction between agriculture and environment, and indeed other ministries, and the process of making that happen, how difficult it was, what you managed to achieve.
So I already mentioned part of this in the presentation. Effectively, we've had trouble getting good participation from our agricultural ministry in particular, but we've tried to also focus on agencies that are part of the ministry and not directly the authorities, so we've got some participation from them. And we are developing strategies through partners that we already have to be able to get there. So we are partners with the Agricultural Research Institute of the country. So through them, we might be able to get more attention. Of course, framing and steering away from any of the maybe contradictory parts is definitely part of the strategy. What has been also a problem for us is during these years, we're changing government and with a very different perspective from the previous one. So we did a lot of the previous work with the old one. Now we have a new one, so we have to start over. That happens.
A generic feature of what we're doing in the TEEB world. I mean, we're talking in general about 3-year projects, and we tend to find we tend to be in every case in the middle of some political changeover or catastrophe or both. Okay, so it's very, very difficult. We have to allow for the fact that there is a political economy here. This is a 3-year project. We have to allow for the fact there'll be changes, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. Better or worse, I don't mean in any kind of, only in the sense that we have a certain agenda in terms of livelihoods and conservation, and it can be very complicated for the project to try and realign ourselves, even if that realignment is actually potentially beneficial, each time there's a change. And that doesn't apply just in Colombia, it applies across many of the countries we work in.
Maybe as a response, one of the things we've actually done is try to not only engage high I guess, decision makers, but also technical practitioners that are more steady, at least in Colombia.
Thank you very much. For the Kenyan case, we didn't have at least challenges in the first instance because we took a different strategy of trying to do, we did meetings, dialogue at ministry level, capitalizing on the relationship that we had with our institution, National Museums of Kenya. So we did several meetings before the inception workshop, like 3 months before that, engaging officers, responsible officers for the Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Agriculture. So, but the only challenge that we faced was because of the time lapse. Once you talk to one officer in charge of the ministry, there were like transfers, so we really had to restart again to engage new officers in the ministry. But it went very well because we did, like, we went for Ministry of Agriculture, we had several meetings trying to explain to them the objective of the project. And it turns out that we were successful in a way, because by the time they were coming to the inception workshop, they already know what the objectives of the project were.
Good. Your experiences in Tanzania.
Okay, thank you very much. So at this stage, for the case of Tanzania, as you know, this project is actually hosted under Vice President Office, and basically they're dealing with the environment, and we have engagement with the Ministry of Agriculture as well. But of course, we don't foresee any challenge in terms of putting on board all these stakeholders together in the future. Of course, the main challenge has been the concern for environment and agriculture has been in terms of water availability, especially when you're talking of the Rufiji River Basin. We're talking of water availability for the environment vis-a-vis agricultural practices, which is going on upstream. So I don't foresee any challenge of engaging all these stakeholders and looking at different scenarios of policy change in engagement of the stakeholders.
Okay, in this state of the Thailand project, right now we haven't found any challenge yet, but from my previous experience in another project that I need to deal with the people from the government or farmer. So the first thing that we need to do is when we before starting the project, we need to talk to them in advance what we are doing and what outcome we are expect, and then we ask them to like help us to clarify or make some decisions that they are interested. So in this case, it's kind of like if they get involved since the starting of the projects, they are usually like we become like the co-worker, colleague, working together for entire project. So this is going to be the strategy that we plan to do. Yeah. But one thing that I experience but rarely happen is similar to the Kenya. Sometimes we're starting working with these people from these organizations, and then the project continue for some time, and then they change. So we need to start over again with the new one. So, but this happen, but rarely happen. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'd like to bring this session to a close, and I'd just like to thank the participants in the normal way. So thank you very much.